Hey everybody, it's the GameSmith and welcome back to another episode of the GameSmith Foundations series, which is dedicated to helping you understand the fundamental principles of tabletop crafting. Today we're going to be working on dry brushing, which is an easy way to show highlights and details on any textured surface that you happen to be painting. But before we head to the table, I'd like to ask if you enjoyed today's content, if you'd please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you really like it, hit that bell button so you know when the next video is coming out. And if you'll really like it, please head on over to Patreon. For as little as $1, you can subscribe and get extra content. If you happen to need any of the materials that we talk about in today's video, please head on over to my Amazon affiliates in the description below, and then you can help this channel prosper into the future. So, enough chit-chat. Let's talk about dry brushing at the table. So, welcome to Dry Brushing Foundations, an easy way to show highlights and details on a textured surface, just like this. I've spray coated a piece of cardboard here with a lot of texture on it to illustrate my point on how dry brushing works. So if you imagine this surface here being represented by this edge. So we have a lot of textured surfaces with the high points, with middle points, and with low points. And the goal of dry brushing is to cover just those 3 points there, but leave the recesses in between devoid of any dry brushing color. That way we're only picking up the most highlighted points of the surface and we're leaving everything else black. That's the goal. So, my favorite tools to do this with are a flat paintbrush like this one here. I like the point on the end in case I need to get into little corners. And I recommend you do not use a pointed paintbrush like this one. You want to use a flat one like that. So, I also recommend you have some kind of palette surface and a paper towel or a napkin. I like the textured kind because they take the paint better when I'm taking the paint off my brush. So, I need to put a little bit of paint on my palette. And I get my brush. And I just load up my brush. And I start dry brushing. You see what I did there? This is absolutely the wrong thing to do. I overloaded the brush. And when I started painting my surface, I covered the surface with the paint. All I'm doing is painting it. I'm not dry brushing it. That defeats the purpose of the dry brush. I had too much paint on my brush. This is the correct way to do this. Get a new surface, and I will put a little bit of pigment on my brush. And then I go over to my napkin, and I remove as much of the paint as I can. You want to use both sides of the brush. Then I go over to my piece, and working from the highest point to the lowest, I start dragging my brush down. And you immediately see the difference between the two. This and this. Now, I don't have a lot of paint on my brush, and that's fine. I can build up multiple layers. And what I want to do is drag my brush in one direction over the details from the top or the highest point to the lowest point of the texture. If I need to get some more, remove it from my brush. And repeat the process. Now, it's important to remember that while you're doing this, to pull the brush down, don't push the brush up, because you'll end up getting the brush inside the little cracks and crevices on your textured piece, and that's exactly what you don't want to do. So remember to pull the brush, don't push the brush. All right? So I'm also lifting the brush and dragging it down over the piece. And you see that I've created a nice little highlight here. Now this is a very light dry brushing, and I could do multiple layers in order to bring those up. Now, I need to be careful that I don't dry brush too early in the process. And what do I mean by that? Well, imagine that I'm painting this dragon. I've base coated this dragon that I picked up at the dollar store, and I wanted to highlight this with dry brushing. So I dry brush it, and then it's like, oh, I decide I want to make this particular dragon look like a stone statue. So I then go over it with a few different coats of gray and brown in order to give it a stone texture. But now I've eliminated all of the dry brushing that I did on this dragon. So you want to do the dry brushing at a time that minimizes any errors like that, and so you don't end up having to repaint your build. Okay? Now, we could go back to this piece and do multiple layers in order to bring up that highlighting. Now, that is just one simple way of doing dry brushing. Now, if you want to up your game for dry brushing, this is what you're going to do next. So for the next level of dry brushing, what you're going to want to do is to use 2 or more different colors, but similar, different colors in order to highlight the different layers of dry brushing on the same surface. So what I would do is start with a darker color and then work my way up to the brighter colors. So I'm going to paint a surface with this vanilla first, and then I'm going to dry brush the vanilla with the white, which I've already done on this piece. Now, the other big mistake that people tend to make with their dry brushing is they try and put too many layers on before their piece is dry. Make sure each layer is dry before you paint over it. Now, what we're going to do with this dry brushing is I've already painted this with the vanilla. Now, because this piece is black on base coat, it muted the vanilla so that it appears more white than it actually does when it comes out of the jar, which is fine. But now I'm just going to go over this highlighting with the white acrylic paint. So again, I go back to my palette and I load up my brush just a little bit, and I want to remove again as much as I can, and then I go back to the piece. Now I'm wanting to stay in the highest level, so if you think of these as the high point, midpoint, and low point inside the texture surface, I want to stick to the high points and the midpoints. I don't want to go into the low points. So I'm just going to go over these high points here with my dry brush. And I just want to pull those textures up by highlighting those individual spots at the highest points. And there we go. So you can already see that the difference between the vanilla color that I used and the white acrylic color that I used on this build. So we could also do something like stippling and dabbing, in which all you're doing is you're loading up your brush a little bit, removing as much paint as you can, and then rather than dragging the brush, what you're doing is you're stabbing down. So, you can see the effect there. The difference between this side where I was doing traditional dry brushing and here where I was doing stippling is that I'm on the stippling, I'm getting more of the white into the cracks and recesses of the textured surface. So if you're wanting to just stick with the absolute top layer of the texture, you're going to want to be doing the dry brushing rather than the stippling. Now, there's one more technique that I'd like to show you, which is called overbrushing. Now, overbrushing is simply where you load up your brush with probably a little too much paint and then you overbrush those areas again. The difference here is you want to use a lot of paint to make those brighter areas or those raised areas much, much brighter. So this creates a significant contrast between the lower areas and the upper areas. But you have to pay attention to the edges of your textured surface when you're doing this so that you don't create that splotchy surface like you did with the first example. So we'd use the exact same technique, but our brush is much, much more loaded with color. So you end up with these very, very bright contrasts on your textured surface. And there you go. That's overbrushing. Now, if you have any questions or comments, I'd appreciate if you put those in the area down below. And I hope you have enjoyed this dry brushing foundations video. And I will see you at the table.